Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to remind you that my book, Drummers on Drumming, is available now on Amazon as both a paperback and an ebook. Based on the Big Fat Five segment of this podcast, where I sit down with my favorite drummers to discuss the 5 records and stories that shaped their approach to the instrument, this book is packed with insights from the drummers who redefined how we think about the modern drum set. You can grab your copy now by checking the link in this episode's show notes or simply searching Drummers on Drumming on Amazon. So thank you for all the support, and now let's get into the show.
Ben, hello? You there?
Oh, hey, what's up, Chris?
What's the status on your laptop? Do you have the podcast for this week?
Yeah. No, I actually had a good buddy of yours, Steve Goold, was on the show this week. Any fun stories you got for me?
Well, actually, it's kind of cool how I met Steve. I met Steve playing drums as an opener when he was playing with Owl City. I was playing with my brother when he was doing a solo project. Met Steve, and then actually became his tech maybe like a year later. So it was cool that I already knew him. And yeah, Steve was kind of there for the birth of all of this. I kind of walked into the first day of rehearsal with a crude prototype of the Big Fat Snare Drum stuff, and he was super into it, and we became friends, and the rest is history.
Yeah, he kind of mentioned that he's going to sue you. So I didn't want to bring this up at this conversation, but
good thing my cousin is a lawyer. No, there was really not. No, I'm just kidding. Please don't sue me, Steve. I have nothing.
All right, dude. Well, I'm gonna go.
Go make a sandwich. Enjoy.
All right, peace, dude.
Bye.
All right, we're here with Steve Gould. Thanks for being on the show, man. Appreciate it.
You bet, Ben. Thanks for having me. I enjoy this kind of stuff a lot, so I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
So if people don't know, this is a big deal because you are the Steve of Steve's Donut.
I am the Steve.
How does it feel to know your biggest accomplishment is having a 7mm plastic head named after you with a hole in the center?
Dude, well, I'll tell you that story briefly. Chris and I meeting when he was a crew member for Sara Bareilles, handling all of her guitar and keyboard changes, and then because he's also a drummer, he's like kind of taking care of my world as well. So he wasn't just my drum tech; he was doing a lot of stuff on that tour. And I know he had worked for Sara for many years prior to me getting on board with her group. But early on in the rehearsals, he's like noticing all of these different snare treatments that I have, and I had them all named. The one where it's just like a drum head just cut out in a circle, like the original muffle that you guys call it. Like I called that the pancake. Okay. And then I had one that had the center hole cut out, which I called the donut. And I had written on them in Sharpie, like the ones like the pancake and then the donut. And then I had one that was made out of a T-shirt, which is kind of like the EQ, the Roots EQ muffles that are out there. Like the T-shirt one, it does that same thing. There's the cloth. It's got a different, vibe to the muffling. That one was called the waffle. So I had like the waffle and the pancake and the donut. And I
like
would
your carbs.
write out exactly breakfast foods. Yeah, I would write out for Chris on the set lists, like for this song it's this snare drum with the waffle, and then for this song it's this snare drum open, but then for the next song same snare drum but add the donut or whatever. And he thought all that stuff was really cool. And he's like, you're not the first person that I've seen who like cuts out old drum heads, but you are the first guy I've seen that has like different versions of it. And like I've been thinking about starting a company about this, like this kind of thing. Would you want in? And I'm like, no, heck no. Like I am not businessman guy. Like I don't. That intimidates me, and it makes me so uninspired. Actually, it's so uninspiring to think about all of the logistics behind running a company and administrative headaches and whatever. So he was like, well, I'm going for it. And so he did, and he ended up showing me like an early prototype of the first one, which had like a thicker rubber gasket around the outside and kind of like cut too much decibel when you put it on the drum, like change the muffling but also change the volume output significantly. And then he like showed me he was making ones that had the hole cut in the center, like my donut. I'm like, oh, that's cool. And then one night I remember we were in New York, maybe doing like a TV thing or a one-off or something like that. And he's like, hey, I got something for you. Are you in your room at the hotel? I'm like, yeah. He's like, all right, I'll come up. So he comes up and he walks in the door and gives me like a packaged Steve's Donut, and it says Steve's Donut on it, like on the package. And I was like, what is this, man? He's like, it's the model that I'm going to sell. I'm going to name it after you. And I was just like, dude, I was so moved. Mm-hmm. I was like kind of like tearing up a little bit, like, oh my gosh, man, like, thank you. Like, I wouldn't expect him to include me at all, because, you know, it's not like I've got proprietary like rights in the in the idea realm or whatever that's called. It's like I don't pretend to own any of this. The fact that you would loop me in any way felt very like generous of him, and I'm proud of it, man. Like I'd probably tell people way more often than is appropriate. Like, oh, that was named after me.
Well, it's funny that no one really ever questions it. It's just like it's a part of the drummer's zeitgeist now. So it's fun that it's not like a weird name. Like, why? It's just, you know. But I'm happy to have Steve Goold, the guy. So, dude,
like I said, it's cool to be associated with it in that way, and it's not something that Chris needed to do at all. Like he just did not need to do that, and the fact that he chose to is something that I really admire and appreciate about just what kind of a guy he is, you know?
Yeah, I admire Chris for quite a lot, so I'm in the same boat as you. He did actually, speaking of Chris, want me to ask, do you still have the rack that he built for you, the little side snare rack?
Yes, I do. I don't really use it, but I have it.
That's awesome. Well, we were joking. I was like, that's kind of something we should maybe make a few of them and see if people like. Is it because, like, exactly what you were saying, you're very particular about your snare sounds and stuff, so you had like not only what, you know, just the pancakes and the waffles and stuff, but you actually had different snares that you'd interchange.
Yeah, I had 4 drums on that tour, 4 snares, and so the one would be sitting on the drum set, and the other 3 would be sitting right behind me. Mm-hmm. And instead of just like sitting them on the ground, he like just made this little rack so they wouldn't roll away. They're still like sitting there like vertically instead of like on their side. They're not like stacked up on a shelf. And so the rack was really low profile. It's just like a really smart idea. Like, oh, good thinking, man. He did the same thing with I have these Brazilian like goat toenails, like goat hooves.
Okay.
That are like a rattle. Yeah. And I set them on the drum like a muffle. So, you know, like people put their car keys on the snare or whatever, and they kind of like rattle a little bit. Mm-hmm. Obviously these goat hooves rattle a lot more because that's the whole design of them as a percussion instrument. When they're sitting on top of the snare drum and they kind of make this weird kind of crackling sound, it's cool. It's like a really dry hip hop snare drum that is clipping on the preamp. It's kind of like the vibe of it. And he saw me playing, and you know, I'm playing and kind of like pushing them up every maybe 8 bars because they would start to slide down toward the middle of the drum, and I push them up again. And he's like, dude, I'm going to come up with some way so you don't have to keep pushing those around. And I was like, oh, it's fine. I've been doing that for years. And he's like, yeah, but I mean, you shouldn't have to. Next rehearsal, he had gone out and found a magnet and like a little like hook thing and just attached that so that they would stick to the hardware on the rack tom, and then just stick there. And then they didn't slide down ever again. And then when I wanted to take them off, I would just like undo the magnet and stick them onto the hi-hat stand. So they're just like dangling there on the hi-hat stand. So they're at the ready. I mean, It was like such a great idea. And it's like, man, Chris Mazzarisi just connecting dots and making my life easier.
His mind is always spinning in the most peculiar ways peculiar, but also like obvious ways. Like, why have I not thought about that?
Right. And helpful. Like he's got a unique perspective that everybody once they get on board with it, you're like, oh wow, all of us have benefited from this idea that only you had.
Yeah. Well, we could talk about Chris all day, but let's get into the top 5 drumming moments that shaped, informed the way, or changed the way you play today. So you sent me 5, and you sent me the specific sections of them, so I have them all set to go. But the number 1 is a band so I'm from Seattle, and I feel that it's sacrilegious that I never got into them, but it's Go off Versus by Pearl Jam. And if you just want to kind of set it up, and then we can listen to it.
Well, the setup is that when I started playing drums in 1991, that was like when Pearl Jam, was on the record cycle of 10, like their first album, their like breakthrough record. And Nirvana had put out Nevermind, and like Green Day was just about to release Dookie, and like all this kind of like Stone Temple Pilots, their first record, Core, the alternative like post, like the glam rock, butt rock thing in the 80s, like moving past that into the 90s thing. That was right when I started playing. So this is all really formative music for me, just from the perspective of 11-year-old, 12-year-old Steve hearing drumming for the first time after having learned to play the drums myself. Obviously having heard music in the 80s when I was a child, but not knowing how to play drums, I'm not connecting the dots of what I'm hearing to what I could do on the instrument. Figured out how to play drums, and the first album that I started listening to closely after I learned how to play drums was Pearl Jam, was 10. And then I got really into it, so when Versus came out, which I think was 92 or 93, I was a little better at drumming, and I was more excited about Pearl Jam, and this opening track just kind of bowled me over the way the whole thing worked. And I'm so excited about this entire record, but in particular, this first track, Go, is just like it's a kind of like a revisiting of the earliest version of Steve being super pumped about drums.
Okay.
Like this, there isn't a track that would do that more than this one.
Okay, yeah, let's play it. So you have the beginning, basically the opening sequence, and then also same song starting at 2:39. So I'll drop both those in.
That moment, that opening sequence, I remember the placement of the kick drums in that pattern. 1, 2, and 3, 4, like boom, 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 boom. Like that was just something that I'd never heard anybody do that, and I didn't know how to do it at first. Like when I heard it, I knew what it was, but I didn't know how to play it. And it was one of the first things that I remember experiencing that. Like, I hear what's happening, but I can't get my foot to actually do it. I had to go really slow and kind of like deconstruct the whole thing. I like how, as a band, they kind of just, you can almost hear them just like sound checking in a way. It's like they keep like starting and stopping. Dave Abruzzesi's playing with such like cool pocket. I love the way the like weight of the drums feel, even though the snare is tuned really high and kind of almost piccolo-ish tone, but he's playing like he really means it, and then they stop and they do that kind of like 7-cycle polyrhythm thing. It's like a 7/4 measure right before they drop into the downbeat of the tune, where they all hit together. Yeah, he like counts it off 2, 3, 4, and like that. The math of that again for like 12-year-old me. It's like prog rock kind of, and I'm like trying to figure out how that all works, trying to like wrap my head around what exactly that was, so that I could count the tune off for myself and kind of imagine myself playing it. I did this thing back then because people that were older than me, they're like, hey, if you want to learn how, to get better at the drums, if you want to grow as a musician, you should just play along with the records that you like. And I was like, oh, cool idea. I just can't do that because it's 1992 and I don't have a stereo system that's loud enough to compete with my drum set. And I don't even have like headphones or whatever. All I have is this little like tape player radio thing. And it's not anywhere near the volume that I would need it to be to play along with the music. So I did this exercise all the time called the imaginary band, or that's what I call it now with my students. But it's basically like I would listen to the tune until I had it memorized, and then I would stop, press stop on the tape and run downstairs to the basement where my drums were, and then play along with the song as if the rest of the band was in my head. And like I was listening to the lyric and listening to the guitar parts, and maybe like I get done playing like the second chorus and I couldn't remember what came next in the song, so I'd run back upstairs and listen to it and like, oh yeah, that's what happens next, and then run back downstairs and try to play the whole thing top to bottom. And eventually I had that entire record, the first album 10 and then verses, like I had the whole album memorized with like all of the parts in my head, like the bass lines and the guitar lines. And I would get home from school and like perform the whole record like it was a concert. And I would like imagine I'm just by myself in the basement playing along with what feels like the full band, and then kind of like finishing the song and imagining that there was like applause and then like counting off the next tune. And I mean, I just had I would burn hours and hours after school doing that at age 13.
Did you set up a mirror and like just like try and look cool too? And
no, it wasn't about that. It was about my imagination. Like I already looked cool just in my imagination of like I'm not in my basement anymore. I'm playing these songs with Pearl Jam and we are in like a club. I remember a lot of the performances took place in the club kind of atmosphere where they shot their video for Even Flow, because it's just like a live performance video.
Okay.
And I'd seen that on MTV, and it's like, oh, that's the kind of place that Pearl Jam plays concerts. So that was the kind of place that I transported to in my imagination.
Yeah. Did that influence the way you tuned your drums? I know you did mention how high-pitched that snare drum is, but did you try and make yourself sound like that as well right off the bat?
Yeah. Totally. One of the first pieces of gear that I bought after the initial drum set that my parents got me, which was just like a garbage generic brand called like beginner brand called Sunlight. I got a 13 by 4 Premier snare drum. Like like it was like a birch or something. Like the wood was just like a blonde color, 13-inch by 4-inch depth, and I could kind of crank it up to that like Spin Doctors kind of tone that everybody was going for back then.
Sure. Yeah, that intro's cool too. I mean, for the 7/8 thing that you're talking about, but also it kind of starts almost 3 times, because he starts with that beat and then he pauses with the hi-hat, does his little doubles, and then goes into it. So it's kind of the arrangement of the beginning is a little more avant-garde too.
Yes, which, you know what? Like nobody told me that was avant-garde. Nobody said this is not how you're supposed to do it. Like it just seemed like the way you would do it. Yeah. So I had this idea, like bands will sometimes have an extended intro to one of their songs, and that's fine, as opposed to like Don't Bore Us, Get to the Chorus kind of like rule. It's like I wasn't, nobody had taught me that yet. Nobody had taught me Don't Bore Us, Get to the Chorus. Instead, I was just like listening to this intro and thinking, man, this sounds really awesome. And it kind of like the 30 seconds or so where they're just kind of like jamming and starting and stopping, like you're pointing out, it kind of revs the engine a little bit for that moment when like the guitar starts feeding back and he counts it off and they do those hits. It's like it's more exciting at that point than it would be if they were to just kind of come out cold with those hits, which I think is a cool lesson in just like context and how to maybe like lay down a plot instead of just drop in on the punchline right out of nowhere, but like kind of like set it up a little bit.
Totally. And it's been like 4 minutes since you listened to it, but is he playing quarter notes or eighth notes?
On the hats?
Yeah.
Dude, it's quarters. That's something I picked up from Dave Abruzzese really early and then have subsequently realized was more of like a Max Weinberg thing in Bruce Springsteen's band.
Yeah.
Like smashing quarter notes on the sloshy hi-hats instead of always eighth notes. It like that tempo, that's pretty quick. Right? What is that? Like 130, 135?
Yeah.
And like he's like there's not a lot of room to play eighth notes. So if he were to force the issue with the eighth notes, everything would feel a little more cluttered. So it's like he's kind of gracefully gliding over the top of that with a lot of power. It's still playing at that faster BPM.
Which makes
it's like
I was gonna say which makes that bass drum pattern he's doing that much harder, because he's doing 16th notes on top of, but it also leaves room for the guitar, because I noticed that during that part, the maturity of that, take away what the guitar's doing, it's just a cool beat. But I'm curious if he consciously did the quarter notes because the guitar's doing the 16th notes, so he's letting that be that subdivision that keeps it moving a little bit. So you get the energy, but the hi-hat doesn't need to be doing, some hip-hop beat that I would assume to do right away.
The unison that's happening between the guitar and the bass, they're both playing that riff, which is like a lot of notes.
Yeah.
And I remember young me was kind of like, oh, when the bass player's playing a lot of notes, I should play a lot of notes with him.
Sure.
And then, you get a little bit older and realize, oh, man, oftentimes the bass feels way better if I just let him take all those busy notes and I myself stand in the background with something more spacious. And then the two kind of complement each other instead of just always assuming that I will like unison double what someone else in the band is doing. In fact, I remember one of my good buddies, Chris Morrissey, he was the MD when I was in Bareilles' band. And he plays in Mark Giuliana's band now. Like, he's like a jazz guy.
Oh, wow.
He and I grew up playing jazz together in Minnesota. And I remember, 21 years old, we were playing in a trio with this guitar player. And he said to me once, he's like, I feel like, Steve, every time I play something, you just, try to play along with me the same thing. Like you imagine that the only way for us to play together is for you to double what I'm doing. But sometimes, if I'm playing something, I want you to play something that marries well without doubling, like complementing instead of doubling.
Yeah.
And I was just kind of like, oh, wow, that's a great idea, Chris. Thank you. I mean, kind of feeling foolish for having not thought of that myself, but also grateful for, he and I are the same age. We kind of came up with the same, he would also tell you that Pearl Jam was one of his, initial favorite bands, even though now he plays jazz, and we were playing jazz together at that college age period. But we have the same kind of musical pedigree of development, and to have him speak in also we're on the same page, we're on the same age group, we're on the same point in our musical journeys, but he still had really great points to help me grow, and it was owe a lot to that guy.
Yeah, a similar thing happened to me, not directly to me, but when Aaron Sterling mentioned, he's like, the bass drum doesn't have to always do what the bass is doing. Just that little tiny thing was like, what? No. It always has to. They have to be married. The bass player and the drummer have to be best friends. It's
right.
Like, no.
I want to know what the bass player is doing.
Sure.
I want to know what he's doing, and then I want to choose to play exactly what he's playing or choose not to. And I want to be able to give you an explanation for why I made that choice. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly not a hard and fast rule or law that I have to just double what the bass player is doing. Definitely not.
Raghav Mehrotra on the last episode was talking about Elvin Jones, how whenever he played with Coltrane, his ride cymbal would always do complementary but also opposite rhythms and I forget the name of the pianist that he referenced.
McCoy Tyner.
He was... Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, Sterling, you mentioned his comment about the bass and the kick drum. Sterling's a jazz guy. There's something about the jazz world that almost forces you to listen a little more closely and consider the way things marry together in all the myriad ways that things could marry together. And it doesn't surprise me at all that Elvin would have that kind of listening chops. Because that's just kind of required of the jazz musician, and in rock is less. There's less need to listen. There's not necessarily any less benefit. It's beneficial to listen in both
Sure.
situations, but in rock you're not required to listen as closely as you are in jazz. It's one of the many things that I find really valuable in that kind of cross training exercise. I don't get hired to play jazz ever anymore, but I still listen all the time, and I think it puts my head in a better spot.
Yeah, that's kind of why I did this format selfishly, is to be influenced to more drummers that I don't know, and a lot of people have given me some cool jazz recommendations. So it's been very beneficial, which is
Right on.
A few weeks ago I wouldn't have been able to even mention the Elvin Jones thing. So I'm cool now.
You're cool now,
This is
Ben.
a big deal. Hey guys, we'll be right back with the show, but I wanted to talk real quick about Waves Audio. I use an endless amount of their plugins, including the vocal writer for this podcast, and for my drumming, I use the SSL channel, Abbey Road Saturator, CLA drums for that easy, quick, polished sound, and many, many more. We're an affiliate member, and if this show brings you any sort of value, please click the link in the show notes to make your next purchase. It supports me directly and helps keep the show going. So, all right, now back to the top 5 ways to make soup. All right, so number 2, Oh No, the Radio, off the Owsley self-titled. And I actually don't know Owsley, but I listened to this song, and I love power pop. So I'm assuming I will like a majority of their other stuff. But you just said start from the beginning and play through the first minute. Let's listen to it, and then we'll discuss it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a flawless recording. Whoever engineered that is amazing.
Right? Okay, so I want to say this quick about Will Owsley. It's not a band, it's just a guy. His name was Will Owsley. He lived in Nashville, played on a bunch of people's records, like as a session guy. I think he was in Amy Grant's band for a little while too, as the guitar player. Wow. He's the songwriter and vocalist on that stuff. And he committed suicide, I think 15 years ago or so, tragically. Obviously, like, mental health is a real thing, and people feeling depressed or whatever, man. I mean, it's plagued the art world for the entirety of at least the modern music industry. So, like, rest in peace, Will Owsley.
Yeah,
he made 2 records of his own stuff before passing. That's Chris McHugh on drums on that. And Chris McHugh is one of my heroes. Like, dude, when I first came across his playing, was in the 90s. He was in a Christian band called White Heart for a little while. And then I kind of, like, didn't realize that was him in White Heart. And then in the 2000s, when I started paying attention to session players, like especially in the country world, in Nashville, the Christian and country stuff, started seeing his name over and over again and started realizing that every time I really liked the drumming, it was always him playing. He plays on a lot of the stuff that Dan Huff produces, like all the Rascal Flatts records, and like almost everything that Keith Urban did for the first half of Keith's career. And he plays on like every Carrie Underwood record, and his pocket just feels incredible to me. So there's that. Like you pointed out, the tones, and like he's always working in environments where the engineers and the techs are just dialed in and the sounds are incredible. Yeah. But then he's got this extra little degree of smartness that I notice in his playing, where he's always playing the thing that feels like, the obvious right choice, which is kind of how modern pop country works. Like that genre doesn't revolve around like innovation in the parts. It's not like indie rock or stuff where people are getting really creative about how to approach. It's just backbeat, straight ahead fills, and yet there's always these little ingredients in Chris's playing, whether it's in the grooves, his kick drum patterns, or even in the fills or whatever. They're not run of the mill. They're interesting, and it's interesting on like a couple layers deeper than the surface. So like I always find myself really enamored with his choices, even though it's a Carrie Underwood track, and all of his choices fit within the goalposts of just that kind of music, like radio friendly and maybe allegedly canned or like formulaic, but not McHugh. And like I've just gotten so much out of listening to him. Like I would consider myself a disciple of his playing, even though I've never met him personally. A good example of what I mean in that song just now is after that first chorus, the way he drops those eighth note triplets at the end into the downbeat, but between the snare drum and the floor tom, it fits perfectly in the moment, but it's not the kind of thing that anybody expects right then. But the unexpectedness doesn't throw me, at least as a listener. I'm not like, whoa, that was out of left field and out of nowhere, and I think maybe a little bit forced, and maybe the drummer was just trying to prove to me that he knows what eighth note triplets are.
We hear you, bud.
Like,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I get it. You went to music school. It's like, no, he actually sounds like, I mean, to me it feels really coherent and interesting in the context of the whole song, which I guess that's like an example of how Chris McHugh impacted me. It's like, here's something that the artist is going to feel great about, the audience isn't going to be distracted by, but anybody in the room who's a drummer is going to notice a little bit of additional sauce compared to what the standard approach would be.
You're always trying to, as a drummer, make something, and maybe this is my approach, you always want to have these things that make people air drum in the car. Like, oh, there's this part coming up, and then someone who's driving just goes, That's the thing that you kind of strive for. That's not too complicated, but someone who doesn't play drums looks forward to it.
Yeah, dude, it's like a hook.
Yeah.
It's like a literal, using the drums to create a counter melody that functions like a hook, and people end up humming it to themselves, which is what makes them want to air drum it. I feel like, Dave Grohl didn't show up on any of those 5 moments, but he's a master at that, playing fills that become part of the song, where, in most instances, the drum fill is kind of like just a transition device to get you from one part of the song to the next, but the fill itself doesn't actually matter in the minds of the listeners. It's not memorable, and guys who can create memorable, hooky drum fill moments, that's what makes people want to air drum, and it's like such a wonderful contribution to the music. That entire record, the self-titled Owsley record, it's one of my Desert Island records.
Well, again, if only for just the sonic value of that, everything sounds so good. Those toms at the beginning, so punchy. That's like the definition of that modern punchy drum sound.
Yeah.
All right, number 3, which is Mojo Pin off Grace by Jeff Buckley, and that's Matt Johnston. We love Matt. Okay, I have to interrupt. This is the second time I've done this in this podcast. It's Matt Johnson. Johnson. Damn it, Ben. I actually took a few lessons with Matt in Echo Park a few years ago, and then I didn't go back because I was like, what you just told me is I'm going to spend the next 10 years working on. So, but you said so it's off that track. Start at 3:45, and then the moment starts at 4:19. But yeah, let's just start at 3:45.
That's like the third time around that moment has happened in the tune, like the turnaround prior to a verse. He's got that like Afro-Cuban thing happening, and then dragging the snare drum along, like however you want to count the tempo. If these are the quarter notes, then those are the triplet eighth notes, and he plays a figure that takes the triplet eighth notes. Like he goes to straight eighth notes and then just quarter notes, and it feels it feels like he's got the snare drum on like a dial on a drum machine, and he's just like turning the dial down, like it's like in Ableton, like it's just like via processing, it's just like like a downturn in tempo, like a what do they call it, Dicellerando or whatever. Like it's slowing down manually, like someone's imposing a slowdown on it, but he's just like playing that, and he's just accessing his knowledge of subdivision. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons why that track would stand out to me, that whole record. One of which is just like Jeff Buckley singing like a Hindustani vocalist on like a Ravi Shankar recording or something. Like Jeff Buckley's singing like an angel while also playing in like rock context. All that stuff was pretty influential for me when I first heard that music in like, I guess it would be like 2000 or 2001 when I first heard that stuff. And then listening to the complexity of Matt's like subdivision awareness. That's, I mean, mostly what I'm saying is that it sounds like a dude who plays jazz, understands world music, understands rhythms that aren't just rock and roll, and then revisiting a rock and roll context with that understanding and having the kind of nuance to bring into those little moments that are just like kind of flying under the radar, but they like those details just, man, it gets me going. I'm so into it.
It's so crazy as a drummer thinking that something you do could it's definitely not a throwaway, but something so small could influence someone 20 years later and continue to influence someone. Such a cool, like, just make every note matter. No note left behind.
Yes. I have a friend in Nashville who says that you don't ever play notes that are neutral. The notes that you're playing are either helping the song or they're detracting from the song. So you've got to treat every note that you play as if you're trying to be helpful. Because, I mean, I feel like I remember the periods of my life as a drummer where I thought the decisions I were making were like more or less neutral. Like I could just kind of play whatever I wanted, it didn't matter. Not realizing that if I'm not aiming for my notes to be helpful, then they're probably unhelpful. Like the thing is probably worse because I'm playing those notes and I'm just telling myself that they're neutral and that it's fine and that it doesn't matter. Yeah. And I can just kind of like keep myself entertained with all of these extra notes that are actually just bogging the whole thing down.
I think everyone's inclined to do notes that shouldn't be there. I mean, I would say any drummer, you play your first take just to kind of get the sounds, and you go in the control room and you're like, 80% of what I'm doing should not be there. You know, you're always, your first assumption of what the song needs is always overdoing it. I'm assuming in this format, there's going to be a lot of grace on this. So I'm excited that this is a new one to dive into. So the next one is Where Does a Stranger Go on Christmas Eve off Body Popping by Happy Apple.
Body popping. But it's the title.
Body popping. It's spelled body, and I don't even know why. I think because I mentioned Brody Simpson. So Body Popping.
The full title of it is Body Popping, Moonwalking, Top Rocking. And it's all like breakdancing moves.
I'm definitely not going to edit that out. All right, so you got to have, it's the first minute. Let's listen to it.
Okay, so here's a little background on that band. Happy Apple, they're all from Minneapolis. The drummer's name is Dave King. He's really well known.
That's Dave.
That's Dave. He's not known for being in that band because Happy Apple sounds so similar to the Bad Plus, and the Bad Plus has just always had a lot more of the music industry machine behind it in terms of marketing and whatever. But Happy Apple is a lot older than the Bad Plus. I think Happy Apple formed in like 96 or so. And that's Michael Lewis on saxophone. Michael is in Bon Iver. So if you recognize his tone, like on a tenor, like I remember when, I guess it was the second Bon Iver record where some like saxophone playing started showing up like in the band, and I'm like, man, it sounds like Michael. And then I found out that it was. His sound is really signature, and I really love his musicianship in general. He played bass in Andrew Bird's band for a while. He's just Michael's one of the like staple corners of the Minneapolis music scene, which is where I'm from originally. That's Eric Fratsky on bass, and he's playing electric bass, even though it's like a jazz group, like upright bass is maybe the more typical sound. But the electric bass affords all of this polyphony, like playing more than one note at a time, almost like a guitar, which, as you get to know Eric, like he's first a guitar player. He's in a bunch of metal bands in the Twin Cities, and like he plays the bass like it's a guitar a lot, and it really helps in that group because the saxophone is a monophonic instrument. So to have a instrument that can play chords and intervals, and then the great Dave King on drums, who was my teacher, like 1999. I met Dave in 98 and started studying with him in 99, 2000 and 2001, all like real intensely. He was a groomsman in my wedding in 2002, and we've been close friends ever since. That particular track, I think that was recorded in 2000 or right around there. I was around for a lot of the recording of that record, and I remember seeing those guys play that song live a few times before it ever turned out on a record. And he's using a mallet on the snare drum, and then his other hand, he's just his hand, like not like a stick, and he's doing a ton of muffling of the drum manually with his hands so that he hits it and it sustains, and then on the next hit when he hits it, it's totally dead because his hand is there, and he's kind of like lifting the hand up and down, and then like going over to the floor tom, hitting the floor tom, and doing the same kind of like controlling of the sustain of the instrument, which is something that up until that point I'd never really considered. Like the drums aren't something that I thought of sustain as like an option for me to have influence on as the player. Like obviously the bassist in the band, like, strum a note and then grab it and it doesn't sustain anymore. And I guess you can do that with cymbals, right? Like maybe like the end of a song, I hit a cymbal and then grab it so it doesn't sustain. But the snare drum having a length to it that I would cut off, that I just had never thought of that. When I saw Dave playing that song, maybe for the first time, would have been like 98 or so. I was only 18 years old, and just like he just broke a lot of the rules for what I thought the drums, the way you would play a drum set. I had myself in a box about how to play a drum set with a bunch of walls and parameters in that box that I didn't realize I had put there.
Yeah.
And watching him play, and that track in particular, the way he controls his touch, he's playing softly, and like just the rhythms and the shape of the sustain, it really changed me. Like I said, it just expanded the box that I had put myself in as far as how to play a drum set. It's like you use sticks, and he's got mallets, and you have sticks in both hands, and it's like, he just has a stick in one hand, and then you just hit the drum and let it go, and he's like, nope, I'm going to hit the drum and then I'm going to stop it, and then sometimes I'm going to hit it with my hand already on there, and it's going to sound like a weird kind of blip compared to the actual tone that the drum can produce. All of that stuff was paradigm shifting for me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very jealous. Dave's mind works in a very specific, very out of this world way. I mean, with the rational funk thing, he's one of the funniest guys ever. We can just see with his humor how his mind is he looks at things so differently. So that's awesome. At such a young age, you were influenced to looking at it that way.
Man, it was an absolutely essential link in the chain for who I am as a musician now. Like that, Dave King is a creative genius. And not only is he just an absolute juggernaut badass at the drum set. He's also really articulate and very well spoken about subject matter that is inherently dense and complex. Like understanding art the way that he understands it, you can't. It doesn't work very well to just kind of grope for words and try to like come up with metaphors that don't work and then say to the student like, you know what I mean? You know what I mean? Like they're just not going to learn anything. And he never did that. He always just had really eloquent, effective ways to convey these really deep points. And again, like at age 19 when I met him, nobody was saying to me, hey, by the way, he's really avant-garde and really out there creatively. Like, no, I just assumed that the way he thought was how everybody thought. Yeah. And then it wasn't until a lot later that I was like, oh, that dude is special. And I got a front row seat to that kind of creative depth. When I first started taking lessons from him, it was $20 an hour. And then after about 6 months of that, he offered me free lessons in exchange for driving him around to some of his gigs, because he and his wife at the time, like, she was working like a night situation and like needed the car. He's like, Steve, how about can you drive me some gigs coming up and like I'll just give you free lessons instead? Maybe we could do like 2 lessons a week to make up for it. And I'm like, yes. So now I'm getting 2 lessons a week for free, and I'm driving him all over town to his gigs that he had with various people and getting to like watch the show and hang out with the band afterwards and meet these people and rub shoulders and like see what it's like on the real, like on the street level of what it means to be a freelance musician in Minneapolis. And it was all like unbelievably formative in terms of my development as a musician. And I would not be where I am now if it weren't for those years.
That's awesome, man. I'd love to have Dave on the show eventually too. His choices, I'm sure, would be.
Yeah,
I know I wouldn't know any of them.
Yeah, but they'll all matter, man. Like he's like I said, he's a thoughtful dude, and he has an unbelievable gift as a communicator.
Yes, and again, to plug Rational Funk, for him to be that satirical and make a point by also poking fun at it, you have to have the ultimate perspective of whatever you're jabbing at to really have it be effective. And
he like, I promise you, he's riffing all of that. Like they're not doing like takes to make sure he says the script right. There's no script. He's just improvising everything. And that's what makes it so hard hitting. I remember, actually, that was another thing I learned from Dave really early on, was just knowing that in the jazz context of watching Happy Apple play. I mean, I saw Happy Apple play live probably 50 or 60 times before, like between the years of 1998 and 1999. Like just in there, like I would just go see them play almost every week. And it's like, these guys are definitely improvising, because that's what a jazz context is. And yet Dave's control, and even like where his eyes would move on the kit and the fluidness of his motions, it looks as if he's playing something that he has like rigorously rehearsed, something that he has completely scripted, and now he's just going through the motions. Like, that's how smooth his execution is, even though he's coming up with, I know for a fact that he's coming up with all of this stuff on the spot. But there's zero like frantic energy. There's zero scrambling. You can't see him like trying to come up with what to do next. It's almost as if he's in complete control of what's coming next, even though he's spontaneously composing it. It's just breathtaking.
Yeah, I have not seen him live yet, and I can't wait for the day I finally get to.
Man, it's going to change your life, or at least it did for me.
All right, so last one. It's let's see if I can pronounce this right. The Truth off of Speak by Dogs of Peace.
Yeah.
And you said it's the first minute, and then again at 1:10. Mm-hmm.
I truth. Don't you ever think twice. You'll be with me in paradise.
So that's a Nashville session guy. His name is John Hammond. Plays on a lot of Christian records, and with like a cover band called the Smoking Section. It's pretty rad. His brother Mark Hammond produces a lot of records in town. I think Mark plays drums too, but John's just like legendary Nashville session drummer. I'm not sure how old he is. He's definitely older than me, and I came across his playing as I was just getting into the whole like read the liner notes of the session guys period, like I was saying with country music and stuff in the early 2000s. I started paying attention to that. That band is Jimmy Lee Sloas on bass, who's another like Nashville legend, and Gordon Kennedy on guitar and vocals. All three of them are just like session, just heavyweights. They're so good at their respective instruments, and they know so much. And you can just hear it in how clean all of their performances are. So, like, one of the things that hits me super hard about that particular excerpt is just, like you said, like how his shuffle is just impeccable. The pocket is unreal. And he's playing really complicated stuff with dynamic control, not just rhythmic control, but dynamic control that's just next level. The thing that really blew my mind about that track, though, is that fill, where he's playing like floor tom on the right hand, rack tom on the left hand, like, and then repeat that, two more, and then two kick drums. So like groups of 6, like like that kind of like triplet 16th note thing. Yeah. And then he does it for the full measure. It's like a measure of 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, bah! And then on beat 6 he hits the snare drum. Like, but leading into the snare drum, he plays one more right hand on the floor tom. So the like quarter note pulse, or the dotted quarter note pulse that leads into that, I guess what figure would that be? It doesn't matter. The point is, like, the cycle that leads into that snare drum is 7 notes, not 6.
Okay.
Where he takes the same amount of space where he's been playing 6 notes the whole time, and then just squeezes like one more note in, which just kind of blew my mind, thinking about how that mathematically works out. And the only reason I know that is that he's one of the first guys that I ended up getting in touch with via social media. This would be right around like 2008 or so. I had, my MySpace page, and I had a blog on WordPress, and I would write on my blog all the time. And I used MySpace to reach out to a bunch of, kind of famous drummers that I didn't have their phone number, but here's like, the first iteration of social media where suddenly these guys are available for me to chat with if I just ask them. And it was interesting because they were all like really flattered. Remember I talked to Billy Ashbaugh, I talked to Anton Fig, Paul Maybury, talked to John Hammond, and like, these dudes are not necessarily famous in any real sense of that word. They're just somebody
famous to me, all the guys you just said.
Well, right, but they're famous because we're drummers. But it's like they don't have this barrage of DMs on their social media, especially because social media is so new at that time. So all of them responded, like immediately to my inquiries, and I was just asking John, like, how did you play this fill at the beginning of The Truth? Like, how's that go? And he explained it to me, and I kind of like worked it out. A couple years later, we kept in touch. A couple years later, I was in Nashville for rehearsals with Owl City, and it was the first time that I'd ever been in Nashville for like a very professional reason, So I felt like go out on a limb and ask John if maybe he wants to like if I can get together with him and he could give me a drum lesson in person or something. And he was like, "No way, I'm not going to give you a drum lesson in person. How about we go out to lunch instead?" And I was like, okay, that's cool. He's like, all right, we were at sound check rehearsing for the tour, and he's like, I'll come by and pick you up, and we'll go to the pharmacy like, what time are you gonna break for lunch? Like, probably like 1 or so. He's like, okay, is it cool if I come a little earlier and listen to you rehearse? And I was like, yeah, that's totally fine. He came, dude, he came at 11 and listened to us for 2 hours. And then we went out to lunch, and he bought lunch for me. And the whole time was like sharing with me all of these players that he knew because of his age, and like all these guys from the 70s that I didn't know about. And was just like, he just went out of his way to be helpful and like give me an experience that really shaped me as a student of the instrument, as an up and coming professional myself. Just very like mentor actions on his part that were not necessary. He didn't charge me any money for it. It wasn't like he was just there to help, and really helped. And I was, so anyway, huge shout out to John for being an absolute badass of a drummer, and like the innovation and the coolness of that fill, but more importantly, the kind of like the demonstration to me of how to handle one's position in the music world. Like, obviously he can tell that I'm really looking up to him, and instead of capitalizing on that and kind of like looking down on me and like basking in the cool points of like my enamoring, instead he just like came alongside me and like just taught me a lot and demonstrated so much generosity and intentionality with kindness. That really left a mark on me.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Did you, I mean, how'd you play knowing he was watching you? Was that the most nerve-wracking thing ever?
I think I played pretty well. I mean, I felt good about it. He was complimentary. This is funny that we're having this conversation right now. I was using the pancake back then.
Okay.
In Owl City. This is like the summer of 2012. So long before I even met Maz. And he specifically said, we got done with the rehearsal, and he was like, how did you make your snare drums sound so different between a couple of those songs? I didn't see you change drums. Like, what happened? And I was like, I have this little cutout thing that I like put on the drum. He's like, can I see it? Like, yeah. Like, we walked up to the drum set. I show him it. I show him the pancake and the donut. I'm like, yeah, they have these different kind of muffling effects. And he was like, wow, that's really cool. And then like, I remember him, like we still have meals together on occasion when I'm in Nashville, and he'll mention like, yeah, I ordered one of those new big fat snare drum things with the tambourine jingles on it. I'm really pumped to get it. Like, again, this dude is like a generation further down the road than me in terms of the music industry and his career path and all this kind of stuff, and he is as excited about y'all's product as any of us are.
That's cool. I mean, it blows me away that someone who is that rehearsed wouldn't have, rehearsed in, the scene, wouldn't have thought to do something like that by then.
I think he spends most of his time in the studio world. And honestly, when I'm in the studio, I usually use sheets of newspaper to get that effect instead of the actual big fat snare drum muffle. The muffle came up in my world, like I started cutting out drum heads in order to get a clean, like easy to take on and off version of the newspaper, because the newspaper, leaves all these little like pieces of newspaper all over the floor or whatever, and it's hard to like keep on the drum. And I'm looking for like, playing local gigs. I'm looking for a quick and easy and like kind of pro way to get that sound. So I'm, using a razor blade to cut out my own drum heads. And I realized if I cut out an ambassador, the weight of an ambassador was like too much. So I would cut out an emperor and use just one of the plies on an emperor, and then that was like a better weighting. But all of that was just like me just like throwing stuff at the wall to try and come up with the best way to do it, like DIY. And I think that was only for live purposes, is my point. And from what I know about John, he's usually in the studio. Dude, I went and saw him do a session, I guess it was 2 years ago now, April of 2019. So yeah, a year and a half ago, I was in Nashville to do a clinic at a church, and reached out to him and you want to get dinner? Like, oh man, I'm totally booked, but I am going to be doing a session. I think it's called Day Wind, it's like a Southern gospel label, and like it's like classic Southern gospel music. And he's doing a session for that stuff where he's like sight reading. It's like the kind of sight reading where you've got 2 music stands because it's 7 pages and they're all taped together.
Yeah.
And I came in to watch them track. Dave Cleveland was playing guitar. He was like kind of a Nashville legend. This guy Jason Webb on keys. Watched these guys one take sight reading like a 6.5 minute gospel song, and he had his rack of snare drums in there, and they one take the whole thing, and they come in and it's like, yep, that's it. The producer's like, yep, that's the one. And so then Dave Cleveland goes back in to overdub acoustic, and Webb goes in there to overdub B3, but John doesn't have to do any overdubs, so he brings me back into the studio to like show me his snare drum rack. And he's got his like flight case where you remove the front and there's just like 16 drums all on shelves, and those drums, like they're all like dialed into the tuning that he wants for them.
Exactly.
Instead of using the same drum to try. This is a long story, but I'm just like he's not the kind of guy who's using muffling treatment on the same drum over the course of a live gig. Yeah. He's in the studio one taking stuff at a pro level. I mean, like that dude, that really impacted me. I kind of sat in the control room watching these guys sight read and play like they had rehearsed the tune 20 times, and just impeccable. I mean, it's so inspiring, and again, like so much further down the road than where I am right now. I'm 40 years old. I've been doing this for a while, but I can't do that, and I hope someday I can.
Yeah, you driving around Dave King and going to sessions like that, just going to lunch with John, it's like that is way better than being in your practice studio and like working on accenting doubles on the E, Well,
both are important. Like there was a period of time, again, in my teens and in my early 20s where I was in the woodshed like everybody else needs to be. But it's, that you're right. That's not the only thing. Watching YouTube tutorials, practicing on the practice pad, reading articles in Modern Drummer magazine or whatever. It's like there's also these like real life kind of fly on the wall observing experiences that I've had where I can trace a lot of very important lessons to those settings, which I think is why it's so important to get involved in like a scene.
Absolutely.
And to have like an actual teacher or a series of teachers, as opposed to just like signing up for a web-based thing or just practicing on your own at home. Like getting around other musicians and watching how they do it and learn. It's definitely a big part of my journey, at least.
Yeah, even just going to local shows. I mean, sometimes it's like the worst band in the world, but the drummer does this one thing with the hi-hat, and you're like, all right, well, that's just changed my playing now.
Yes. Yes,
don't just only go to the Key Arena shows or wherever you are.
Right, the local stuff.
Because a lot of times the people that don't know how to do it think of it in a cooler way than you, who, know everything, quote unquote.
Sure. Well, innovation is by definition kind of like going against the rule of how to do it and coming up with a different way that turns out to be just as viable. It's just not the one that they would have taught you in school.
Yeah. Well, not to totally trivialize or go a different direction, but that's the time. We've been talking for an hour. I've loved this conversation. If people don't know who you are, if they don't want to find out more about you, where can they find you on the interwebs, and do a little self-promotion here?
Well, I've got a YouTube channel, so if you just look up Steve Goold, my last name is Goold, which is somewhat uncommon for the name Goold. So if you look up Steve Goold, I'm going to be the only one on YouTube that you'll find.
Okay.
And then that same name, Steve Goold, is my Instagram. I do a lot of stuff on Instagram lately. I've been having fun with doing Q&As every Thursday and sharing playlists on Fridays and sharing like GoPro footage on Mondays, and just kind of like trying to engage the Instagram audience that way. So Instagram and YouTube are a couple of good spots. And then I have a online drum lesson thing that I do where I kind of like interact with the users over video chats, and then use my content on the website called the Drum Library. So if you look up just thedrumlibrary.com, that's my lesson website. I've been teaching drum lessons for a long time, and finally decided to try and like put together a catalog of everything. It's kind of like a diary, actually, or like a journal of everything that I think, just put into video lessons and all on the Drum Library.
That's great. I know on your YouTube you have a video that's titled "How Rhythm Works," and I like the way you describe like a valet parking a car, and it's a little more of a beginner explanation of what rhythm is, but it's a cool concept. And so people, if you're looking for some lessons, I do appreciate the way you compartmentalize information. So I think a lot of people would find great value from that.
Thanks, dude. I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, I really enjoy. I'm just kind of a deep thinker in general, I guess. Like I enjoy philosophy and all that kind of stuff. I have a degree in theology actually from my undergrad, but what that leads to, I guess, is me just like teaching drums for a long time and playing gigs for a long time and just kind of putting everything that I learned, things that people tell me or things that I observe in myself, like putting it through the ringer of my own scrutiny. Like, is this idea going to actually work, or does this carry any actual weight? Does this hold water? And then like trying metaphors out on my students and seeing which ones they grab onto and which ones they don't. And then now, again, after having done it for this long, I feel like I've got a good handle on how to get a point across, and I enjoy doing it. So like, especially over the last few years, I've done a lot more like clinics and public speaking engagements at churches and colleges and stuff, like giving master classes or seminars or whatever you want to call it. And a lot of that stuff is on the website. Some of it is on YouTube too. And it's fun. It's fun to do. I guess like not everybody's cut out for that. I suppose is the way to say it. Like some of my friends back, I remember in my 20s, they're working at coffee shops and they're like, "How do you have enough gigs to pay your bills?" I'm like, "No, not really. I just teach a lot of lessons." And they're like, "Oh, yeah. I hate teaching lessons." And I'm like, "Dude, I don't. I love it. I have a great time. I'm always game to teach, and I feel like it over the years has really sharpened me as a player too, to just figure out how to think about stuff. I guess that's my point. Like thinking deeply about things and figuring out how to think about it in a way that I can convey that to another person who isn't me and doesn't their mind doesn't work the same way mine does. So if I kind of have to like take an idea that I understand and reform it into a different shape in order to get them to understand it. And I enjoy that challenge, and it always makes me feel like I've learned something myself after I'm done.
Yeah, and I hate that phrase, "those who can't do teach," because so many of my friends that are teachers, they get off on teaching. They just love that, seeing that light bulb, and that's like the most gratifying thing they can do, even sometimes more than walking off a stage after playing to 10,000 people. It's knowing you've just changed someone's life for the better. It's a really fun
Dude,
thing.
That adage, that phrase you just mentioned, "those who can do and those who can't teach," like, dude, I carried that with me in a negative sense for a long time, and it was last summer 2019, I guess. I went to Africa for a couple weeks and taught at a music school over there with some friends, kind of like volunteering the time, and I had such a blast. And I got back from Africa and I shot this series of video lessons for Scott's bass lessons with my friend Ian. Scott is this dude from London who has a major presence on the online music lesson community through bass lessons. Scott's bass lessons is like a huge platform. And I was a guest on there with my friend Ian, who's a great bass player, and we kind of like team taught all these rhythm section things. And those two experiences, teaching in Uganda and then doing the Scott's bass lessons things, was like, you know what? Forget about this whole like those who can do and those like. I'm a teacher. I love teaching. I'm gonna like start playing offense in my life about teaching instead of playing defense. Like, oh, I'm only gonna teach if I don't have a gig.
Yeah.
Like I'm gonna teach because I really enjoy it, and I'm gonna stop kind of like looking down on myself for it, which has been kind of like a freeing thing.
People that say that are in the similar line of thinking of people that say Ringo's a horrible drummer. Anything afterwards, I just don't care.
That's a great metaphor, man. That's a great example.
All right, well, thanks for coming on, Steve. Hope to see you soon, man. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too, Ben. Thanks for having me.
All right, peace.
See ya.
And that's the show. Be sure to check out bigfatsnaredrum.com and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at bigfatsnaredrum. The audio you're hearing was edited in part by Isotope RX8 Audio Editor, so go check that out at isotope.com. Cheers.